Here we reached the end of the line here on our Theory of Evolution lecture series. I hope you've enjoyed the series and thought it was intellectually stimulating and it provoked some critical thought regarding this very multifaceted and I find fascinating line of inquiry. And in this particular segment, I'm going to lay my cards out on the table and I'm going to tell you what I think. And not to try and win you over to my camp of thought, but just to help distill out, I think, some of the pieces of evidence that I've been caught on and wrestle with and how they've shaped my own philosophy or philosophy of what has happened in the past. Okay, and I start in a little bit of an interesting spot. I can't get my mind over ancient Hebrew cosmology, and actually I believe this is a cosmology held by various ancient societies, but they believed if you take some of the passages from like the Psalms and Job and Genesis and put them together as well as some other ancient historical data, the picture that you can draw to summarize what the ancient people viewed about the earth is something like this. They thought that there was these pillars of the earth that somewhat bordered the earth, and that there was a shield of ice that wrapped and protected from the waters above, and that the earth was basically suspended in nothing but water. There was water above and there was water below, and then even in the earth there was seas, but these weren't considered the waters above and waters below. Okay, now, and then they thought the sun and the moon were inside of this space. Okay, now what's interesting about this is there are planets out there that don't have a very dense amount of CO2 in their atmosphere, and so consequently they're very cold, and any of the water on that planet freezes as ice. So it's like a solid ice ball in essence. And this is an artistic rendering of one of these such planets, and there are others as well. So imagine if that was the case when the Earth was formed, and it's not unreasonable to think that it was the case. If there wasn't any life on the planet, there wouldn't be any CO2 in the atmosphere, there wouldn't be anything to insulate the heat and keep it towards the Earth. It'd be very cold. So imagine that when the Earth was formed, it turned into a big sheet of ice, a big ice ball, okay? And imagine that the continents were all together in a supercontinent. This is something that I think most old Earth proponents would believe, that all of the continents were at one point together in a supercontinent, however millions of years ago. Okay, now imagine then that there would be various events that would cause warming, such as, let's say, some of these plates opening up and like a thermal hole opening up to down to the crust of the earth that warms up some space. Well, imagine over time, whatever the events are, and it's thought that if through the different climate data that are out there, the ice cores and such, that there have been sequences of warming and cooling and warming and cooling. Well, imagine on some of these sequences, maybe some of that ice thaws, and now there is a pool of water that is forming in that space where the ice is thawed. And maybe that it's only a pocket, perhaps. Maybe the ice is still covering it, but a pocket has thawed. Well, it would end up looking then something somewhat like this, where you have this whole sheet of ice like this that covers around the entire globe, but just a small, and maybe this ice is actually pretty thick, and it's forming a ball that wraps around the entire Earth. And maybe there is a spot that has melted because of whatever reason, some geological shift in the plates and an exposure to a geothermal vent or something that heated up the ice and melted it. And maybe that water then seeped down into some deep recesses in the earth, but now it exposed some dry land. Okay, and then if that was the case, there would still be some water, the puddles that were remaining, and then there would be the higher spots in the earth that would be dry, and then everything else would still be ice. Okay, but now there's a place here for land creatures to live, plants and animals and things like that. And, you know, in the ancient cosmology, they thought the sun and the moon were inside of this firmament, but in reality, if you didn't have a plane or you didn't have a satellite, you wouldn't have any idea of knowing if it was out here shining through or if it was on the inside. Like, I would imagine this ice would be very transparent. And if you have something as bright as the sun shining through, you're not going to be able to tell if it's on the inside or the outside. And then furthermore, they believe there were windows in that firmament, and then it would occasionally rain, and when it rained, it was from the waters above. Okay, so let's imagine there is an atmosphere out here, and there are clouds and weather patterns, and when it rains, that rain basically slides down the ice and trickles down through these holes in the firmament, and they called them the floodgates. Okay, I don't think this is really that far-fetched to believe. If if most planets are big frozen balls of ice, why wasn't ours? I would think it's very reasonable to believe ours was a frozen ball of ice. And furthermore, if you look at how the mountain ranges are today, and we imagine all of these were brought back together to form a supercontinent, you could almost infer that there was like a big mountain range coming across here. This is showing us, anywhere in red is showing us the highest elevations. And then it comes across, so it's basically like this, comes across through Greenland, and then it comes down through like this. Okay, so imagine all this land was actually folded in, and when this supercontinent was still intact. Well, if that was the case, you would have a big rocky mountain range going along the perimeter of this supercontinent. And you would have, let's imagine at some point, way later on in the history, perhaps a lot of this has thawed, and as there are more things undergoing cellular respiration, there's more CO2 released, there's more things that are heating up the land, so more ice is thawing out. Okay, it eventually would form a container with the mountain ridges. You've got these big mountain ranges that are probably still full of ice, and everything else is still ice, and maybe there's still ice spanning over this space, forming a big hollow ball of ice. But underneath it, there's this pocket of water, and there's still high places where there's dry land, but there's also seas that are formed. But it hasn't been able to escape out the mountain ranges yet, because this is all solid ice, and everything beyond here is solid ice. Okay. And then let's imagine that this continued through several cycles. There were several cycles of thawing and then thawing some more, and every time it thaws, there's more of the firmament that falls down as rain. There's more glaciers receding towards the edges, and there could, in essence, be several sequences of floods here. You could have one big event that unfreezes a lot of water, and then life goes on, and then another big event that thaws out a bunch of water, and then life goes on, and then another big event. So I almost think that this was the story, and every time there was a big event and more of the firmament thawed, it was something of a flood type situation. And if you look at the layers of rock, it almost makes it seem like this is the case. So for example, if you take a jar and you shake it up, the sediment will separate out based upon its size. The bigger stones, like the gravel, will settle first, and then fine sand, and then silt, and then the very, very fine particles would be suspended in something of a slurry, and all of the dead material would be floating on the top because it's got oxygen in it and it's got oil content in it, so it would be floating. And then all of this gets compacted over the course of a couple of days to form like a clay layer. Well, clay particles are the type of particles you find in shale, and so in my mind, anywhere you find a big layer of shale, it seems to me like the settling out of this slurry of dead stuff. And coincidentally then, shale, and not coincidentally, shale tends to be a layer of rock that has lots of fossils in it. Okay, so if we look at this, we see a couple of shales. There's one, this is the Grand Canyon. We see a shale layer here, and then we see another shale layer here. And I almost wonder if maybe there were multiple floods. So in my view, I think that the Earth was created, and that is what we see here, and probably over here. This is all the pre-Cambrian rocks, so that was created, and that's before life originated or anything like that. Then there was a flood event, and this flood event would have been the first thawings of the firmament, and that washed a bunch of water onto this portion of the land and deposited some sediment, and then the fine clay particles compacted, and that was like flood number one. And then shortly thereafter it filled with water, and this became a sea. So imagine at this point there was a sea here above this shale. Now then aquatic organisms could live here, like snails and oysters and clams, and those are the things, like the shells of aquatic organisms are what have calcium carbonate in it, and that is what forms limestone, at least as far as I understand it, over time. So here, if you look at this boundary, this is one of the only boundaries that's not like a knife edge border. So here I imagine like what it was, imagine that this was, none of this was here and this was a sea. Well, that's why we see this irregular border, I think. This is maybe perhaps millions of years of stuff dying and compacting and stuff dying and compacting, and the edge is not a knife edge because it's subject to the wear and tear of time. And that is what you would expect if things took a very long amount of time, is there wouldn't be nice flat compact layers. They would have ridges to show and reflect all of the different changes that can happen over time. Okay, and then so let's say there's a sea here. Then let's say there's another big flood, and this whole group of sediment gets piled in, and all of the living things that were in that sea are killed, and they're laid down first because they're some of the biggest, bulkier items. Think about a big clam and oyster. Those things, those are big particles, right? And so those shells and things would get laid, the flood would sweep through the known earth and they would get laid down and compacted. And then on top of that, then all of the gravels and things would come. And then here we have another shale. So this is all the settling out of the fine particles and the debris. And that was the end of flood number 2, let's say. Okay, or maybe it was flood number 3 or 4 or 5, I don't know. But then this was probably a big flood because we see a lot of sediment, we see a bigger shale, and we see a big limestone layer formed from it. And then let's imagine that if there was a big flood, there wouldn't be any trees or anything to keep the soil rooted, so it'd be like a dust bowl in a way. And so then let's imagine there was a dust bowl for a while because there was very little vegetation. So you get all this sand blowing around, and actually even way up in Colorado there are these huge sand dunes, which are like, where did those come from? And I think it was probably from this bigger flood that stripped the earth of vegetation, and so now you have loose sediment blowing all over the place. Okay, now the reason why I don't believe that there was one global flood that caused all of these layers is for the reason that you can see animal tracks fossilized in the Coconino sandstone. Okay, if all of this was deposited, like I do believe that it was formed by floods, and so I am a flood geologist. I don't think there's any reason to believe that these discrete layers formed over millions of years and to the gradual subject to the gradual wear and tear of erosion. But I don't think it was all one flood, because if there was a crazy torrential flood that dumped all of these layers of sediment, there's no way it would be still enough for this sediment to settle and then an organism to walk around on there and then it dry and form a fossil. Okay, there's no way. If it was a big, huge flood, there would be tons of sediment constantly being deposited. You would never have the time where it would be still enough where you could have animals walking on it and then it fossilized. In order for it to fossilize, you have to have it be wet. Okay, so this has to be like wet, maybe. You have to have things walking on it, and then it has to dry and get really hard. And at least as far as I understand it. So to me, I think that this marked the end of a flood, and there was some low-lying waters here, and then there was some low-lying waters, and like reptiles or amphibians could walk around. It was maybe like a marsh type thing, and then it eventually dried. And so because it dried, these were held intact. Okay, and then after all this, I think the flood happened, the big Noah flood. And if we look at this map here, and imagine that in all of these floods, more and more of this is thawing out. Well, eventually, once all of it gives way, so let's imagine like the story is like this now. And there's still a sheet of ice that's spanning over here. This is all one big ball of ice, but now the layers of ice are further out here. Well, once this final mountain ridge melts, now this whole bath of fluid can rush out. The main outlets here would be, like if you look at North America, the main outlet to get out of the mountain range, here's the mountain range, the main outlet to get out is the Colorado River. And so imagine that the whatever gateway it was, block of ice that was here keeping the water in, is now free. All of that water that's been pooled in here would rush out like a torrent, and all of, you know, if this was a big event like a huge volcano cooking an oil field, and all of this firmament was melting in one big swoop, the biggest of any of the previous ones, I mean, that would all rush out of here like a freight train, right? It would just rip out of here because it would find this the shallowest place, which would be the Colorado River bed, and it would just crank on that, and it would get shallower, and the more shallow it was, the more fluid would want to come out of there because it's the only outlet. And now, if this is no longer all ice, these continents are no longer locked in by all that ice, so they are free to move away. And so I think after the Noah flood, then the continents did start to move away, and they moved away much faster than we think that they did, because they were now free. They'd never been free. They've been locked in with ice. And so consequently, they moved much faster than we observe them moving today. I mean, today they move very, very slow, and so if you extrapolate back, it makes it seem like it was many, many millions of years it took them to separate out. But if they moved away much faster than they do than we see them moving away today, it could be the case that it was only a few thousand years ago that they were all bound up together like this. There's actually some interesting evidence for this presented in this book called Carved in Stone. This guy here, Dr. Thomas Clary, he was an oil and gas guy, and through some of his data analysis, he pulled together some records that I've never read the book, so I don't know exactly, but I listened to him on a podcast, and basically what I understand is that because some of the tectonic plates are still cooling and their buoyancy and such, it makes it seem that they moved away more recent than people had thought. If it was really gazillions of years ago, they would be quite settled and they would be quite cool, and that isn't necessarily the case as far as I understand it. But I'm intrigued to read this book at some point in time. I haven't read it yet. Okay, so you can imagine then, if all of that water, the floodgates are open, you know, the ice is now thawing and it's giving a place for water to flow. It never had a place to flow prior to this because it was blocked by an ice-filled mountain range, and now that that ocean has thawed, and so now there is a place for the water to go. It would rip through the Colorado River, and that to me is what it looks like here. Okay, this is an amazing amount of sediment moved. I mean, just look. This is the Grand Canyon, and this isn't even the full story. If you look at the Grand Canyon, that picture I just showed you is just showing you this part here, but in fact this goes miles and miles and miles, hundreds of miles up. This whole area here washed away. You can't tell me that that was washed away by a little trickling Colorado River over time. You know, why don't we see this type of activity in any other river? You know what I'm saying? And most people would say the reason why the Colorado River didn't just level this all out is because this is so arid. But there are other arid places in the world that have a very flat river. And that river, like, for example, the Nile in Egypt, like this, it doesn't look like this by the Nile. The Nile is an arid place. And that is just a river like we would, you know, think of a normal river. And furthermore, the other reason why I don't think that this was done by the Colorado River is that way up here at the very top is a place called Bryce Canyon, and in Bryce Canyon these are the formations that you see. So explain to me how these formations formed through the Colorado River. I mean, when you think about all of this material being eroded away by Colorado River, at some point that river was here, and then that river chiseled down, down, down over time, gradually, and then somehow it chiseled away this sediment, and somehow it chiseled away this sediment, and then now it's way down here flowing. I mean, that is a lot of erosion for a river, and you would think the only way that'd be possible if there was tons of rain flow, you know, tons of rain eroding that away, but this is an arid spot. And furthermore, if there was rain that such that it could over time erode this away, you would think that these little tiny wimpy pieces of rock would not still be here. I mean, this is like only a couple feet wide, right? So you're telling me that this erosive power took away this entire thing over millions of years, but it left these little wimpy turrets here? No way. That is unfounded. And again, they would say that these haven't eroded away because it's a very arid region. But look at this. Like there's snow here, and anywhere there's snow, there is precipitation. Maybe not a lot, but you can't tell me that this doesn't occasionally snow and thaw and snow and thaw. And you can't tell me that if the Colorado River can rip through all this stuff and create a Grand Canyon, you don't think a little bit of seasonal snowing and thawing can't erode away these tiny little spires? These should not be here still if this whole process, in my mind, if this whole process took bajillions of years. Okay, so I do think that there have been multiple floods. I do think that there was a really huge, massive flood not very long ago. I do think that the continents then separated after that flood because it was the first time they were now freed from the ice. And that also helps to explain then how the animals, let's say in Noah's flood, traveled, let's see, what is the slide I'm looking for? That also then would explain how if you could have an ark landing somewhere over here, let's say, that then the species could go spread out into places that they found suitable, and then over time, then these would drift away, okay? And that's how they got to all the places. It also explains why the earth describes the Bible describes the earth as being flat, because from these perspectives, I mean, you would think the earth is flat. You go as far as you can this way and you get the mountain range, you get as far as what you go this way, you hit the mountain range, and you can't get beyond that ice into the solid ice ball that exists on either side. So, I mean, you can't blame them. They were describing what they saw, and to them, it looked like a very flat Earth. Okay, now in terms of time, then, the only tricky part is that I think it would take a lot of time for there to be these types of flood, and a lot of time for this amount of limestone to accumulate, and a lot of time for these seasonal changes. So I am inclined to believe that the universe is old, and the Earth is old, and it was covered with ice, and it's very slowly over a long time been thawing away. Okay, and maybe once the dry land was sufficient enough, God created and seeded some organisms there, and maybe those founding organisms then evolved over time. That is probably where I land. Although I hold it loosely. I don't really need it to go millions of years or not millions of years, but I don't think that if God, let's say God did take what seemed to be millions of years to do this, and he did put some founding species on here and then cause them to turn into the forms that he desired through the process of evolution. That's not any less a creative act than doing it in 6 days. In fact, I think it's even a more extraordinarily creative act, because you have to have the forethought of knowing exactly how to create the initial founding species and the conditions required to bring about the intended form that you desire at its appointed time. You have to know, you have to account for every single atom, every single condition for that type of equation to work itself out. Okay, that's an extraordinarily beautiful creative act. That's the sort of act that should just split your heart apart in reverence and praise and worship. I don't see that being anything mutually exclusive with a faith in God as creator, and I don't think that type of notion is any less majestic and spectacular. Okay, but let's talk then about how to reconcile that type of a notion where maybe the layers of rock are younger. They were deposited by sequential floods, but perhaps maybe there was some founding species and evolution did occur over a long amount of time. How do we reconcile that type of notion with what's said in the Bible? So in other words, how do we reconcile a recent Noah flood with an old earth and still maintain some level of theological congruence and avoid being called a heretic? This is how I go about it. I bring it all back to the theory of relativity, which is a recent theory in essence. I mean, it's mid-1900s. This is Albert Einstein, and the big idea, the major big idea, is that the rate at which time passes and also speed are relative. Okay, you think that your speed is absolute, meaning you're sitting in a chair, so you're absolutely going 0 miles an hour. You are stationary, but that your speed is dependent on your position in the universe, right? If you are sitting in a chair, in reality, if the middle of the earth is your reference point, you're actually going like 900 meters per second or something. You're flying, but it doesn't feel to you like you're flying. It feels to you like you're sitting down. But in either case, the speed at which we're traveling is relative. It totally depends on where your point of reference is, and that is also true then for the time, the passage of time. Okay, and so an example would be as our velocity approaches the speed of light, time passes infinitely slower. So the question then is, what is the reference point used in Genesis? Is it from God's reference point, or is it from our reference point on the earth? Now, in order to answer this question, I think we have to look at the passage. Okay, so here's Genesis, and God is going through the days of creation, and so he calls the light day and the darkness night, and then it says, and evening passes and morning came, and that marked the first day. And this happens every time. An evening passed and morning came, and that marks the second day. An evening passed and morning came, and that marked the third day. So God is giving us a clue to the answer. Okay, and here's what I mean. What do we think of as a day? Okay, if we're going with our conscious perception of in our perspective of what a day is, we would say that a day is when the sun rises and then when the sun rises again. Okay, like you could call a 24-hour day from when the sun rises to when the sun rises again, or anything. We use the sun. What I'm trying to say is we use the sun and the moon as our reference point to determine what a day actually is. And then later down the line, we invented clocks that told us that it was 24 hours. But before there were clocks, you had no idea what time it was. There wasn't anything such thing as an hour or a minute or a second. You would just go by where the sun was and where the moon was. Okay. The problem is that the sun and the moon aren't created until day 4. Okay. There's the one to govern the day and the night, separate the light from darkness. Those don't get created till day 4. And so it must be the case then that the perspective that God has in mind is not the same perspective that we have in mind, because he's going off of a length of time that is untethered from the thing that defines what that length of time is to us currently now. Okay, so if it's not tethered to anything that we experience on the earth, then the passage of time is subject to whatever God's reference point is. It's not subject to whatever our reference point is here on the earth. And so it could be that in that case, that billions and billions of years in God's perspective were really just a day, and then it's day 1, day 2, day 3, and day 4. And so when the angel of the Lord is telling Moses that it took 6 days, and he's taking that insight and writing it down in this book, he's getting the perspective from the angel. He's getting perspective from the heavenly perspective. He's not getting the narrative from the human perspective. If he was, there would be a sun and a moon before we even started talking about days, and before we even started talking about evenings and mornings. Okay, so I think this is the clue to the riddle here, that God is trying to show us that it isn't the literal passage of time that we associate from our perspective. You can also make the other theological quandary is that shortly hereafter we have the story of Adam and Eve, and it says that with sin the earth became fallen, and that's when death arose. And so how do you reconcile an old earth with things dying and decaying before the fall of Adam and Eve? But keep in mind, death is something that we perceive. I don't think animals and other creatures have any idea what death is. I don't think animals and other creatures are self-aware. I think all the other animals and creatures are just creatures of instinct, going about their daily activities based upon the wiring and the neural circuits that God has instilled in them I don't think they sit and think about time and sit and think about death. I don't think they mourn when their friends and their offspring are eaten by a lion. I don't think they understand what death even is. I think death is an idea that we perceive, and to do that you have to have a conscious mind. And so it could be the case, let's imagine there's all these fish and there's all these snails and organisms and things running around the planet, and it took a really long amount of time for those forms to evolve into then something that was similar to a human form. And then God takes two human forms and he puts a mind into either of them, a conscious mind, and that's the first time you have humans on the planet. Before that, it was just some animal that looked kind of like a human form. But as soon as God breathes his breath of life into them and he puts a mind associated to their brain, now we have two of the first humans on the planet. And I think those first two humans were Adam and Eve. So I do believe that the story of Genesis is historically accurate. The only caveat is just a little bit of a discussion here about how we should define a day. I think this is from God's perspective, not ours, because there is no sun and moon at this point. And so God's reference point, whatever it is, it was a day to him, but for our reference point here, it appears to be like billions of years. But then as soon as Adam and Eve land, now the reference point is fixed because you have human minds on the planet, on the ground. And so now from there on out, all that's described in Genesis is in accordance to the perspective that we would currently experience it. It's from our own human perception as we now know. And I think that the Noah flood did happen. I think it happened around 4000 BC, or sorry, around 3200 BC. This is why our earliest language is recent as that. This is also why you get dinosaurs that still have blood vessels that you can stretch and they snap back. There's no way a soft tissue like that is 75 million years old. There's just absolutely no way. It's very surprising it's even more than 2,000 years old. So I do think there was a recent Noah flood, and I do think the floods caused the rock layers. I do think that maybe some evolution has occurred, and I do think that it appears to have occurred many millions of years, but in God's perspective it was only a matter of days. And that's how I reconcile a whole bunch of conflicting pieces of evidence. That's sort of my storyline, or where I'm headed. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that if God really wanted you to know, he would have told you. Like, if God really wanted you to know, he would have put one way or another with absolute certainty. He would have put like a huge elephant fossil way down deep in the deep layers of the earth. Okay, I don't think God intended for us to know, and because God has written the story of humanity with a lot of really great, amusing illusions, and those illusions are for our amusement, and those illusions are for us to have a sense of free will. At the end of the day, like, God has written this story, and God is the victor of the story, and it's a fascinating story. It's a great read, and God is the author of it all, and we're just enjoying it day in and day out. And God wants us to have free will. He wants us to be able to believe that there is no God. He wants us to believe that he wants us to be able to have the choice in pursuing him or not. And so he has veiled some of his work behind a curtain, so to speak. He's made it obscure and difficult to figure out for a reason. And so it was always meant to be taken by faith. And I hope that that's the heart that you take with this, that you should pursue your love of God and your love of Jesus out of your faith, and not try and use your faith as a textbook to win inconclusively and unequivocally other people to your point of view. I think it's important to be well versed in the pieces of evidence. I think it's important to be unbiased, and I think that truth will win out if you follow it. I think it's important to avoid getting too caught up in your own predispositions just because they were formed by people around you. I think you should just pursue God and pursue truth, and I think they're one and the same. And we have a couple of clever riddles here in the earth and in the book of Genesis concerning about how it all happened. that's my spiel. So I hope that helps you a little bit, and I hope that helps show how you can look at things in a different way and still not be a heretic, but also open to what science has to weigh in on some of these issues. And overall, I just, I wish you the best of success on this journey, and I just ask and pray that God would give you insight and peace as you struggle through some of these fascinating but also sometimes challenging issues. All right, love you all, and I enjoyed this series.